ran. So let's go look at the console. There's our test. So we started Spring Boot, reset our data. We came in here. The first thing we did was a post. Here's our API. We set the context to application JSON. As you can see here, our body contains the JSON object. Our HTTP response was actually 201, and the application came back with JSON. So if we look, this guy should have failed because I said 200, but we did get back the context with our ID of 3. So then when we did our get, we now have 3 records returned. So we see that the first post worked and the second post returned all 3. However, the first one failed because we did not get a 200. We actually got a 201. So if I update this to 201, restart, and run our RestAssured demo again, and we see everything passed. That's because we received a 201. So we got our 200 for our get, a 201 for our post, and our conditions passed now. All right, so that's 1 and 2. So now let's look at retrieving a tutorial by ID. And let's look at Swagger real quick. So retrieving by ID, so we have to do a get tutorials by ID. Well, we know we have 1 record out there, so let's try this guy out real quick and just put 1 and execute. So we have an ID. Our response should come back as 200, and we should return a record. And a response record should be of type tutorial. And if you look here, here is the URL that we need to pass. So let's look at how we set this up. So if we go over back to our code, so we have request, we have base URI, we have get. So all this is the same with the exception of our get. So get actually now requires an ID. So we need to put in a token for ID. And now we need to set the ID value. So now we need to set a path param, and the parameter is going to be our token there, ID, and our value. So in this case, we want to pass in 1, just like we did over here. So here's our parameters. So we set our parameter ID as 1, and we added ID to our get. So now this looks exactly like what we have here in Swagger. So now if I save this and run again, so we create the tutorial, we retrieved all tutorials, and we retrieved a tutorial by ID. So if I zoom up, the last call here was to our get. So we passed in 1. So we replaced our token. We got back a 200. Application JSON, we set our path parameter ID of 1, and we received back calculus. So that worked. So far, so good. Pretty straightforward. All right, so next we want to update by ID. And as you can see, a lot of this is pretty straightforward. All you have to do is follow some basic functionality of how the APIs are called. By ID, so we already have our ID. So we've already defined our parameters. We've already set our API. However, in this case, we actually are doing a put. So if we go look over here, if we want to update, we need to do a put. So put API tutorials ID requires the parameter ID. So all still the same. This time though, however, we need to pass in our body the tutorial value that we want to update. And we're going to get back a response again for the output. All right, so here we have our given, we have our log, we have our base URI, we have our parameter. So there's 2 things we need to set here. So 1, if we look back over here, we have to specify the application JSON. So in our setup. So we have base URI. We have to set the context type to application JSON. So we've got that. We've got our path, and now we need our body. So to do the body, we need to specify some context. So first, we could do the new like we did up here for the post. However, I want to show you a different way to do this. So you could do this another way. So here, instead of setting the body, you can actually set up a JSON mapper. To do that, you create a map collection of a string and object. And I'm showing you this in case you don't have the POJO or don't have the mapper. So if you do a JSON as map equals new hash map. Okay. And then in here, we're going to do JSON as a map. Need to do that 3 times because we need to set the title, description, and published. So JSON map, we need to put some information into our collection. And now here, we need to set our values. So we know we need the title, we have our description, and we have published. So if we don't have the POJO or we don't have the entity bean that we need to build, this is a way for us to map it back. So if we go look here and just look at this example, we see we have title, description, published. So we need to provide these values here in our put. So we see we have to have string, string, and true. So we're going to come in title, string, some string, and this one will set to false. Since we know calculus is already published, we will change it to something else that's not published. So here I'm going to set our book title to 2001, a Space Odyssey, and again, another space novel, and save. All right. So instead of doing the new tutorial, I'm actually defining our JSON mapper now to mimic what we have to send in our header, this here. Now we do not need to set ID because ID is what we're actually going to pass in as our lookup parameter to set this value. All right, so we have our log, we have our base URI, we have our context type, we're setting our parameter. And now we need to set our body to include our JSON mapper. Here's JSON is map. Putting that looks good. And then we log and we should get 200. So we'll save, rerun, and all of our tests pass. So let's look at our update here at the end, our report. So we know 1 was calculus and math and published is true. We passed in our body of description, published and true. So this is our JSON map. We specified it as JSON, and we set the path parameter ID as 1. So here's our put. And then what came back was ID 1, our new title, our new description, and published as false. Okay, that gives us 4. Now, the rest of these are pretty straightforward, so I'm just going to copy these down here, and we're just going to knock through them real quick. All right, so we have 5. Let's just simplify this for now. So 5 is find all published tutorials. If we look at Swagger, we want this one, API tutorials published. There's no parameters, there's no body, it's a straight up get. So we change this to a get tutorials published. We don't need body. We don't need context. We just need the URI. And that should return a 200. So that one's pretty straightforward. And that would be number 5. Okay, save that, rerun. So that one ran, and let's look at the console. So as we see here, we got back title 3, 4, 5, and 6. All were published true. Now, if we actually were to reset our test, we would only get back one of these because we only had one Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But it's interesting because we're rerunning this test continuously against our in-memory database. It's just going to keep stacking up these values. All right, so now let's find a title containing a string. So test 6. Find by title containing string. And ironically enough, this is actually the first call we did. So if we actually go look back at Swagger, if we look, we do not have a getter for find tutorials by string. If we look, we have API tutorials. And if we expand that, we see here that we can pass in an optional title. So let's go back over here. So here we're going to need a, so we can kind of cheat. We'll just go back up here. We'll need a path parameter. And this one will be title. And we want to look for 0. I want to find the ones with 2001. And we just drop it back down to tutorials. So our API, we pass in the parameter title. We just get API tutorials. If you notice, we're not actually setting anything here. We're just setting the path parameters. Whoops, sorry, wrong one. Yep, so not path parameters. This is actually because this is a path parameter, this is actually a form parameter. So slightly different. So since this isn't a path, but we need to push this with the form. So this will be a form parameter. Now we call get API tutorials. So if I run this, refresh, and run our test again, everything passed. If you notice, we created a tutorial, we retrieved all tutorials. So we're just stacking up our test. So the last one here, we were looking for anything with a title of 0. And since I restarted our database, we got back one record. You see here, we got back 2001: A Space Odyssey because this is the only title with the 0. And if you notice here, if we go back one, since I restarted the microservice, our database reset, and we only got back one Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Bear with me, we're almost done. So next we want to delete an individual tutorial and delete all tutorials. So this will be delete a tutorial. And this is good for cleanup. So if you're running specific test data and you have this option, after you set everything up, you can go through and delete everything and then validate that your records were deleted. All right, so again, let's look at Swagger. So we have 2 deletes here. We have one delete all, one delete by ID. We need to pass in a parameter for ID, and we should get back a 200 that everything was deleted. So, and this has to be a delete request. So instead of get, we do delete API tutorials by ID, API tutorials ID. Now this is not a form parm path because we're updating the ID in the path. And this will be ID and 1. So delete. So we'll delete the first record in the list. And actually, let's delete the second one. So we'll delete 2. And to just test that we deleted this, let's go up and verify by ID. Yeah, here we are. Retrieve a tutorial by ID. So let's copy this guy and add a second test to this one. So this will be 7, 8. Verify tutorial was deleted by ID. And since we're doing 2, we'll follow up with 2. So this should return no record. So we should actually get back a 404 for no records found. And this delete will actually return us a 204. All right, so let's run this. Test is running. Our test is complete. It deleted our record, and we verified it was deleted. So the delete is right here. So here's our request. So we deleted, we passed in the URL, the API with our ID of 2, path form ID of 2, and we received back a 204. And when we tried to validate it, we received a 404 because there was no records found. Okay, and last but not least, let's delete all the records. And we're going to delete all tutorials. And this will be 9. Don't need that. And our delete should be that. And 204, double check our Swagger. Delete API tutorials, no parameters, and it should delete everything. All right, so if I run this, everything worked except delete a tutorial. That's because we actually had already deleted number 2, and therefore it's not there. So what we need to do for this particular test is restart the database, restart the microservice for the API with the database, I mean. Once that's restarted, then we can rerun the test, and everything passed. So if we look at our last command here, we called our request delete API tutorials, everything deleted, it returned back a 204. So now if we actually come over here to Swagger, so I could write one more method to double check this, but what we can do is we can go here to get API tutorials, click try out, hit execute. So it returned nothing. We have no body. All right, so that is RestAssured in a nutshell. So we walked through the different types of commands here. So let's go back and just briefly go over this. So we went through the different ways you can use RestAssured to set up your request header. We define our base URI. We can set context type. We can pass in a body, either through a object or using a Json mapper. We can post information. We can get information. We can use the path parameter ID to set an ID on the URL. We can validate the statuses of the requests coming back using the status code. We can also define our context type within our request and within our response. We can also do forms. So we can pass form information if it does not need to be in the URL. And we went through using the delete and verifying a delete. So are there any questions?
So Michael, I know when it turns green, that's when, like the API ran successful. So is there a way whereby you can, let me say, manipulate it and it turns green maybe, or maybe you can throw in a failure in API, because then anytime I run it, usually most of the time, like it comes out green all the time, which means it's, I'm a tester, because usually I wouldn't know what goes on behind the scenes. So
well, these are all predefined tests. So
okay.
Depending upon your test data, if you're trying to test to make sure everything returns correctly, your validation points, in our case here, the status code, is going to be our assertion. So if you're unsure of what the test is checking, you can go look at the test and then look at what is being asserted. So you could have an assert method here or some type A status code within the RestAssured. With that being said, though, you really want your test to always be green, because if it's not green, then that means that either a code change that was deployed broke something, or the requirements that you're actually testing against have changed, and you need to go update the test case or test data to reflect the changes to the requirements.
Okay, got it.
Any other questions?
Not so much a question as much as just sort of a statement, I think, to follow up with these. As we've done a couple of these now, the tools for testing, particularly at this level, I mean, it's funny sort of as I go through some of these, watch some of these presentations, is it's almost an itch to build out proper testing. And I think it just points to, it's become such an easy thing to do in many cases. When you include the tools, you look at the power of them and how easy it is to just script out some tests. To me, it makes more sense than ever for developers to definitely be a part of it and be building out some of their tests, at least their unit tests, and assisting QA more. And particularly when you look at sprints and the Scrum approach and things like that, where it's not a sort of like a wall between developers and QA, but a partnership. These kind of tools just make that much more easy to do and almost hard to argue against it. It's like, how much effort is it really going to take, other than thinking through some of these tests, to build them out? And particularly when you're coding them in the first place, those things almost fall into place. It's obviously test-driven development, things like that make that more push you to do that. But even if you're not taking that approach, it seems like testing is almost a slam dunk at this point.
Exactly. And it really should be, because even after I did all the presentations on integrating testing in your development cycle, really testing should be a no-brainer at this point. I mean, we've been in the coding now for well over 2 decades, and this whole idea of we need to separate QA from testing really is a joke at this point. Really, if you want to write good code, especially in the microservice world, you have to think from the endpoint. So basically, you have to start with your test, what it is that you're trying to do, and then write your code for it. Because if you do it the other way, you're really risking what is it that this microservice is really going to do for you. And the other way of thinking this way is, as a developer, at the end, when you're done writing your code, you know how to test your code. You know how it was tested. Now, granted, you may make mistakes in what you write for your test cases, but as you get better at this, when you hand it off to QA, or a QA person comes in and tests your code, there should be almost no barrier there. They should be able to just look at the code, look at the test case, and say, okay, here's how I test it. It's working. It's not working. Where did it fail? How can I go research it? It should be all transparent. There should be little or no back and forth between QA and development.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah, I think so. That's a good suggestion.
All right. With that, I'd like to thank you guys for your time. If you want to talk about any of these topics further, or some other topics we haven't touched on yet, send your comments and questions to us at info@developernerd.com. You can hit us on the Contact Us page on developernerd.com website. You can search for us on YouTube under Developer Nerd, and we're also on vimeo.com/developernerd. Our goal is making every developer better. Have a great day.